I'm so excited to have Dr. Kelly Hogan and Dr. VIJI Sathy here to talk with us about inclusive pedagogy. All institutions in the UW system are focused on reducing equity gaps to increase student learning and success. This workshop is really timely as we seek to better challenge and engage all of our students. Dr. Kelly Hogan is a distinguished teacher, scholar, and leader at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her roles include Associate Dean for the Office of Instructional Innovation, Quality Enhancement Plan Director for the College of Arts and Sciences, and STEM Teaching Professor in the Department of Biology. Dr. Hogan's work in improving learning for all students while reducing gaps in performance by race, ethnicity, and first-generation status in a 400-student introductory biology course is well known. Many high-profile media outlets have featured Dr. Hogan as a thought leader on instructional innovation, institutional reform, and inclusive pedagogy. She is the recipient of multiple teaching awards. In 2020, the National Association of Biology recognized her outstanding teaching. Beyond her teaching at the University of North Carolina, Dr. Hogan has reached hundreds of thousands of students globally through her textbooks and published articles offering advice to instructors on how to increase student engagement and success through an inclusive approach. Dr. VIJI Sathy is also a distinguished teacher, scholar, and leader at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is professor of the practice of psychology and neuroscience and faculty fellow of inclusive teaching in the Center for Faculty Excellence in Digital and Lifelong Learning. Dr. Sathy also serves as the Townsend Director of Education Research. Dr. Sathy is a national speaker on instructional innovation and incorporating evidence-based educational practices to flip the classroom in higher education. She has published her findings on applying innovative teaching techniques to optimize student learning and inclusion in quantitative courses such as introductory statistics. Dr. Sathy has spearheaded many initiatives to successfully increase representation of underrepresented students among STEM PhDs, including serving as the lead program evaluator for the Chancellor's Science Scholars Program funded by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Her teaching and advocacy for student success have been recognized with multiple awards, including the 2019 Chapman Family Teaching Award, an award bestowed upon a University of North Carolina instructor with a distinguished history of teaching undergraduates. Dr. Hogan and Dr. Sathy have successfully collaborated, producing numerous publications, including their forthcoming book, Embracing Diversity, A Guide to Teaching Inclusively. Welcome, Dr. Sathy and Dr. Hogan. Turning it over to you.
Thank you so much for those very nice introductions, and welcome to everybody. On the screen here, you can see we had this little activity as people were getting settled today, and some of you answered our questions within chat. Lots of nice responses about seeing family soon, which we both totally agree with. We put this up to kind of model for you what we do with our students. Within our Zoom teaching, we've realized that it's a little awkward sometimes when students wait till the very last minute to sign on. There's this moment where you could really build community. And so we've taken to putting up a variety of activities that students could come and engage in and use the chat or even annotate the screen. So we asked you to put where you want to travel in the chat, but here's an example of doing it where students put hearts on the screen where they want to go. And this started all kinds of interesting discussions in my class around who's been where study abroad programs are good. Oh, can I talk to you later about that? So it's been a really nice way to think about engaging students with something fun to do and to come early. So beyond our academic titles, when we introduce ourselves, we like to make sure we model a few things. So for me, modeling my pronouns is important. I use she, her, and hers. And we know from talking to lots of students that they really appreciate seeing that modeled. And they like the opportunity to be able to add their pronoun as well, but never to be forced to do that. And so taking that plunge and getting used to introducing yourself at all times with any group, but especially with your students on the first day, and encouraging them to do that within their own groups and settings in the classroom is a really important point of identity.
And I'll add that I like to provide this pronunciation guide for my name because it's unusual in the United States. So sometimes people wonder how to pronounce it. So I've given a phonetic spelling here, and you'll see it also in my Zoom window where I've added it to my name there as well. And this is where, I love leveraging technology to help us get things right. And in this case, getting names right is important. We know this is a very essential aspect of belonging and feeling like part of a community is saying people's names correctly. And so I like to have this guide here, as well as I offer to my students and do this myself, have an audio recording of my name that I post in a variety of places like my syllabus or website. So you can click the link that says, how do I pronounce my name? And then it takes them to an audio file where I say it, and in my email signature, for example. And I give students the instructions to be able to do that so that they can also post those as well. And your learning management system may have a feature like this already. And we've certainly heard from faculty across the country, really, and other types of technologies like Flipgrid, ways in which you could quickly create a short audio or video file with your name pronunciation and post it. So I encourage you to think about how you might continue to use technology to get things like names correct. And so we want to provide tips as we move along here. And the tip here is to prompt students to interact socially by introducing themselves and providing basic information about their gender identities and names. Again, we don't want to force people to sharing things, but by modeling and providing examples of what we mean, then we're giving them more structure, which we'll talk about in a minute, about what kinds of things they could share.
And the nice thing about online teaching is you often can have right here on the screen, you can have the ability to change your name and pronouns. So feel free to do that if you'd like to during this meeting. And in person, you can do this as well with name tags, tense, all different ways where you can provide students the option to do this.
So I wanted to get started by asking you, what emotions are you feeling about your spring 2021 term? Okay, so let's just take a moment to consider what occurred. And I appreciate the great chat that's happening, the back channel chat. So thinking about this question, let's imagine we're in a classroom and I have posed a question, an open-ended question to the group. I see some responses coming in through the chat. I don't think I heard anyone unmute and offer an answer. So one simple thing we can do when we are interested in ideas from the room is to pause, right? So to really give people an opportunity to think through what their response is. And the tip here is to build 5 to 7 seconds wait time for more responses. So this is a very simple approach we can all be embracing to be more inclusive. However, this isn't the most inclusive we could be. And this is something that I think is a bit of a tension. We all feel we are being inclusive by posing the question to everyone in the room, but not everybody spoke up to offer an answer. So let's think for a moment about a different question. What are the possible reasons students may not speak up when we pose questions to a whole group? And this time I'd like to model a different approach for soliciting answers. This time I'm going to moderate some quiet thinking time to this question. And then I'm going to ask you to write your response in the chat, but don't hit enter. So just hang on to it for a moment. I'll cue you when I want you to enter your response. But first, let's take 10 seconds to just think silently to ourselves about what are the possible reasons students may not speak up when we pose questions to a whole group. Okay, if you'll find your way to the chat window, you can compose your response. I'll cue you. I'm going to do a 3, 2, 1 countdown. So I'll cue you to hit enter, but just hold on to it. Just type your response in there, and then I'll count you down. So 3, 2, 1, go. Fantastic. See, the responses are still coming through. So just take a moment to scroll through and see some of the answers for why students might not speak up when we pose questions to a group. Anxiety, embarrassment, tired. They may not have even heard the question. It takes them longer to think about the question. Absolutely. Lack of preparation, shyness. Yeah, there are a lot of reasons, right? There are so many reasons for why we might not hear from every student when we pose an open-ended question. And absolutely any one of these could be operating, and combinations of them too, right? So we want to think about how do we invite people to participate in a way that is more equitable, right? So without structure in our facilitation, we're leaving it up to chance that everyone will participate equally, and we don't want to leave it to chance. So one of the things that Kelly and I advocate for, and you'll see it used here in this workshop, is that we're giving you instructions through these blue boxes. So when you see a blue box on the screen, you'll know that these are our instructions to you about some activity or question that we would like you to respond to. And one of the reasons I like using the blue boxes is that students quickly attune to these, right? So if you're, for example, if you are using PowerPoints, maybe it's something else. Maybe you've got Word documents you're passing out and you've got instructions set off in some way. This helps them attune to, oh, it's my turn to do something now, right? So they quickly get used to seeing these cues of how to respond to a question or a prompt that you have. The other reason I like it is because it gives me a chance to quickly visually scan my materials to see if I have enough blue boxes. Are they spread out enough? Is there a desert in terms of interaction, or a place where I feel like maybe I'm going on too long and they haven't had a chance to reflect on something I've shared with them, or to do any kind of active learning, right? So these give me a visual cue of that and where those interaction deserts might be. So you'll see examples of that in our session today, these blue boxes.
Okay, let's move to a short case study here. An elementary teacher teaching remotely asks her students to each make a self-portrait that they can present to the online class when they will meet a week later. Jack and his parent went to the store and picked out supplies. The teacher was effusive in her praise for Jack's creativity and final product. Jill worked on her project with a pen she found in her sister's pile of stuff in their shared room. The teacher told her it was very nice artwork. Jill felt jealous of Jack's work. So we want to have you reflect about this little self-portrait activity that was done in this class. And the question we want you to think about is here on the right. Besides looking different from each other, what are some reasons why the final outcome of the two self-portraits differ? So we're going to send you into breakout groups for just about 3 minutes to answer this question together. And the tip here at the bottom of the screen is that giving expectations about timing adds structure, right? So students know this isn't 20 minutes and they're not going to talk about their weekend and everything else. They're going to kind of get right to it. The expectation is the structure. And we're going to ask you, when we come back, we're going to ask that each group have a reporter chosen who can just quickly share some of your group's thoughts. So when you go into your groups, make sure somebody volunteers to be the reporter. Okay, so VIJI has also put into the chat the instructions. And I am going to just get your rooms open. Okay, so you should see an invitation now to move into a breakout room. All right, welcome back, everyone. If you were the reporter for your group, will you put your name into the chat, please? Just your first name's fine. Great. Let me see if Carolyn, K with a K, Carolyn Littlefield would be willing to share what your group talked about.
Of course, I'd be willing to share. We talked about resources and to get supplies and things, but then we and the ability, and then we got to the parental input part, and we have no idea what the family dynamics are. We know that the first child had both parents there, but we kind of assume that the second one is really working independently. Either the parents are working or they're not there, or so we have no idea what her background is to know why, she did it all by herself.
Right. Okay. So differences in parental resources were pretty obvious to you.
Right.
Great. Let's do one more group. Lene, would you be willing to share?
Absolutely. We talked a little bit about those things. We talked about maybe the expectations, and the interpretation of the expectation was unclear or just perceived very differently by Jack and Jill. And we also talked about how, like, maybe Jack has a more involved parent. We don't know the parental situation. So maybe Jill doesn't have somebody at home saying, oh, let's make this look this way or spend this financial amount on this. So there's a couple of things that we talked about in terms of that. And then also, we didn't know the age group of this. So you could have very different levels of artistic ability and expression, at kindergarten versus fourth grade or something.
Great. Okay, so we've got some ideas about some of the differences, and they certainly relate to resources, parental involvement, expectations. So we want to hold on to all of those. And now think about these kinds of differences that you just noticed in this one activity. Maybe think even more broadly, but how are these kinds of differences? How did these affect students in our own higher ed classrooms? So we're going to use another tool now, whereas the chat, you're not anonymous, right? And we often get great engagement in the chat, but it's not anonymous. And so bringing in a polling software brings in a different tool where you can ask questions differently and also be anonymous. So that's going to engage some students differently. So we're going to ask you to go to pollev.com/Carolina, and VIJI has put that into the chat for you, so you can link right from there. This is an upvote question. So as answers start to come in, if you see an answer that you like, you can just tap upvote on it, and you don't have to put your answer in if it was the same one you were going to put in. So we'll give you a moment to do that. There's some really nice answers here. So at the top, we've got hesitancy to be vulnerable. Next down, students may spend money they don't have to make a project look spiffy, right? So certainly money and resources differ with our students, and the pressure to spend money and be vulnerable definitely is different. Let's scan through a bit. This difference in praise and student experience with all of their education up till now has come up, whether they've received praise, their confidence levels, feeling like they don't belong, work, parenting, other responsibilities. I don't see it right here, but also parental involvement in college is still a thing, right? And if not parental, then some kind of close support, and some students have more of that than others, right? So when we think about the elementary school assignment, we see some things that are pretty obvious. And sometimes I think in higher ed, we don't always see them. They're not always as visible, but the emotions can still be there. This feeling of unfairness and jealousy about the differences in resources and all of that can play out just as much in higher education. Earlier on, I think it was Lene who said something about the expectations maybe around the assignment. And so I would also agree that the elementary school assignment could have had more structure. So think about it like this. The teacher could have said only pencils and crayons are to be used. And the school can make sure that every student has a kit of both pencils and crayons. And then both drawings might better reflect the diversity of ideas rather than the privilege of one family versus another. And so this can hold true in our own assignments as well, right? So thinking about this idea of structure. And this is really the take-home message we want you to be thinking about throughout our presentation, that unstructured learning environments can lead to unfairness, feelings of exclusion, and collisions of students' cultural background with the learning environment. Adding structure to learning environments can mitigate unfairness, promote feelings of inclusion, and promote student success. So we want to be thinking about how we can be empowered as instructors to add this structure to our own courses and help mitigate some of these feelings. So we like to share with you what our definition of an inclusive classroom is. And we think it means that the instructor and the students move away from assumptions that some students are lacking, right? So we don't want to blame diversity. Students come with these differences. We know that. And in fact, we think diversity is a huge strength. We want to move toward the idea that learning environments and course designs lacking structure are a problem. So learning environments and course designs, who's in charge of that for your course? We are, right? We have at least some control over that. And so we do find it empowering that if we can increase structure, that we can really reduce some of the differences and the unfairness that comes to our classrooms, right? So staying away from blaming our students. We often get the question is, how is active learning different from inclusive teaching? And we absolutely don't think that they're different. We like to think of inclusive teaching as an overlay to whatever it is we're doing. So if you think of active learning as a spectrum, the way many education specialists do, you've got on one end taking notes. It's not very active, but while students are taking notes, it's probably because you're talking and explaining something. As we move along the spectrum, we have students beginning to construct ideas where you're asking questions. And then most active, you've got students not only constructing ideas, but doing it collaboratively. And you can imagine along the Bloom's taxonomy of thinking that students are really getting to these high levels when they're doing this collaboratively. But in any one session of class, you may be moving along the spectrum quite a bit, right? So the inclusive overlay is to say, are there structures in place to ensure that all students have the ability to succeed with whatever it is I'm doing, right? So if I'm taking notes, if students are taking notes and you're talking and explaining, and we know students come with differences, right? We don't want to blame them, but we can think about some of those differences. So we may have multilingual learners that can't keep up with taking notes. We may have students with learning differences that aren't organizing things the way you might think to. We may have students who don't come in with a strong background in how to take notes efficiently, right? So those are just three types of students. What can we do to help students? This is the question, right? So one example would be to make skeleton outlines, right? So this allows students to see sort of how an expert lays out a discussion, but doesn't give them everything, right? And so students are still cognitively rearranging things and working to put their outlines together. It helps to teach note-taking, but it also really helps those students that weren't keeping up with it. So when we think about constructing ideas, are there structures in place so that everyone knows the question being asked, right? So VIJI talked about this a little bit with the blue boxes and the visual prompts. I got a real hard lesson in this very early on when I started doing a lot of active learning with 400 students in Biology 101. I posed a question. They immediately all turned to each other and said, huh? What does she want us to do? What'd she say, right? And so it was very obvious I needed multiple modes. So a visual prompt, an audio prompt, right? Lots of different ways so students can access that question when they need it, how they need it. The other thing is pausing to make sure we've got some silence. Students can't construct ideas if we don't allow them some time to think. And we all know that students think at different paces and speeds. Okay, so we want to move on to thinking about the overlay with collaboration. And we want to ask you to help us think, what are some structures that can help more students succeed with group work? So we're going to ask you to do this again with polleverywhere.com. And VIJI's going to put that link into the chat again so you can grab it quickly. And this is an upvote question again. So we're just brainstorming together. Anything that you've seen, or maybe you even remember doing group work, what are some things that help more students succeed with structure in the group work? Excellent. Okay, so you see that silence, that time to construct ideas was really helpful, and everybody's moving at their own pace. We see some ideas rising to the top here about assigning roles, right? So even within small groups, you've got the people that are more comfortable speaking up, and the same people may always take the same role. So assigning roles and maybe even rotating some of those roles are really important. Being clear with our expectations, like very specific questions and tasks. Before they talk, setting those expectations and guidelines. Yep, that has come up in several of them. Even teaching them how to do group work, right? Assigning roles, defining roles, time cues, deadlines. You may even think about the fact that some of the differences come with who has time to do group work and making sure that there's class time for group work, right? Because time is also a privilege. And if you expect a lot of group work to be done outside of class, we may want to make sure we schedule time during class to make that more equitable. So great ideas here. The idea really is that it's about brainstorming the structures that can bring more equity to what it is you're already doing. And this is a great activity to do with your colleagues and your peers to say, I'm doing this thing. Can you help me think through it? Is there something I'm missing in terms of bringing more structure to what I'm doing? So within that inclusive classroom, we think of it as having two structured components: the course design, which is sort of the syllabus and all the things we think about often before we meet our students, and then the classroom environment. So if we think about in course design, who's being left behind by the choices we make? Let me give you an example. If we had a low structure course design, that might look like having one or two papers or exams in the mid-semester, and then maybe a final. So students don't get a lot of opportunities to practice and get feedback. Some students may know that they need to iterate and do lots of editing of their writing, or may need to do a lot of studying spaced out. But many students won't know about this idea of how learning works, and right? So what we need to do is build that into our course. So we build more structure with a lot more practice and feedback, and we include more students in the learning. If we think about the classroom environment and we have low structure, that might be how VIJI started off by posing questions to the whole group, thinking I'm posing it to everybody, therefore it's inclusive. But you listed all the reasons in the chat why some students might not speak up in that way, right? So varying the modes with anonymous forms of communication, written forms, oral forms, all of that provides more inclusion for a variety and a diversity of students. So we want to take a few minutes just to share our own faculty stories with you, and then we want to dive back into you brainstorming with us in a more active way. So I'll get started and then I'll pass it off to VIJI. So I changed my approach about 10 years ago to teaching, and I teach these really large introductory biology courses. And the reason I changed was because of data that I saw from my own course. And here are the data: that 1 in 20 white or Asian students were earning a D or an F, but 1 in 4 underrepresented students were earning a D or an F. And I had never seen data like this for my own course, but I had to own it because it was from my own sections. And I always describe it as a punch in the gut. It really saddened me to see these differences. And around the same time, I was starting to read about these differences within sciences, that nationally only about 40% of students intending to major in the sciences were graduating with a science degree. And even worse, only 15% of minoritized students intending to major in the sciences were graduating with a degree in science. And so I thought about this bigger problem, and I was convinced that not only was there a national problem, but I was contributing to it within my own course. And that didn't feel good, especially when people were telling me I was an effective teacher. Colleagues and students were saying I was a good teacher, and I really had to question, was I? So I wanted to think about solutions. At the time, I was doing a lot of learning about how learning worked, and I was learning loud and clear that it's practice, not lecture, that's necessary for student learning. And we know this inherently, right? You don't watch someone drive and then become this expert driver. You need lots of practice behind the wheel. You make mistakes, you get immediate feedback for it. And in many states, we say you need a certain amount of hours. My daughter's going through this right now. She needs 60 hours of behind the wheel practice before she could drive away on her own, right? So I wanted that same kind of practice in my science classroom. I also needed technology with the number of students that I had, but I realized that technology could also provide a more inclusive approach. And so I settled on thinking about giving students required practice and immediate feedback before, during, and after class. And so I use a homework system as well as a variety of facilitation programs like polling in the classroom. So the solutions that I wanted to try, I thought could really help move the needle on this problem, but I didn't know. And so I had to measure this. And so fast forward to some studies that I did with a collaborator where we looked at 3 semesters of me teaching in a lower structure, less inclusive classroom to this higher structure, more inclusive classroom. And importantly, what we found is that all students performed better. So that was really good news. But performance increased disproportionately for some students. And this was also really good news. So first generation college students improved even more. And this closed an achievement gap for this group of students that I didn't even know existed because I hadn't seen data about that group of students. It halved an achievement gap for Black students, and I've continued to narrow that gap for other minoritized students. Importantly, failure rates dropped by 40%, which means that more students have the opportunity to stay in STEM, and I'm not this gatekeeper holding them back from science, right? It should be a student's choice as to what degree that they want to go for. So because demographic data were so important to me, I'm going to ask you in this quick Zoom poll on the screen, have you seen demographic data associated with your courses? All right, so it looks like we've got about 70% saying that they have not seen these data and 30% that have. And you are representing a diversity of campuses and departments, so it's not surprising that you have a diversity of answers to this. But I would encourage you on your own campuses and departments to think about who would you need to talk to get data like this, because they're often highly protected data. Who should you include in that conversation, and what would you do with data like this? VIJI and I have been involved in conversations on our own campus, and we've been privileged to be able to work on a tool called the My Course Analytics Dashboard. And you see here a quick snapshot of it where you're looking at differences between student groups and then also broken down by grade distribution. So you can learn not only who is in your courses, but also grade distribution. And all of this is done when the semester ends. And we can look at a variety of demographic factors. So just some food for thought for you, and we'll leave it there. And I'll pass it to VIJI now.
So I wanted to share a little bit about my motivation for redesigning my course. I teach one of the courses I teach is an introductory statistics course. It's primarily for psychology and neuroscience majors, but there are some non-majors in the class. And oftentimes students will come to me even before they say what their name is. Sometimes they'll say, I just want to warn you, I'm not very good at math. And I think for some of you who teach subjects where there's some quantitative aspect, you may get this kind of a sentiment from your students. And I found it really frustrating because they got into my institution. I knew that they could do well in an introductory course, but I didn't really appreciate that they felt like it wasn't going to go well at the outset. And so this article in The Atlantic really spoke to me about this notion of being bad at math and thinking of it as some kind of innate ability rather than something that we could approach with a little bit of a different work approach, right? So Kelly was talking about practice and how important that is. Could I impart some empowerment in my own students to think about approaching this course with a bit more practice or different practice than maybe what they've experienced in the past, particularly if they didn't have what they considered successful experiences with a quantitative course. So one of the things that I considered is the kinds of feelings I had in the classroom. So I'm showing you an image of a fish swimming upstream and out of water. This to me is what teaching felt like. Swimming upstream and out of water. I'm also sharing it because there are a couple of idioms, and idioms were really challenging for me to understand growing up. English as a second language learner, not having the internet to sort of Google what phrases meant. I was always trying to use context clues about what things meant. And so now anytime I can use an idiom correctly, I try to. And then in this case, the feeling of teaching felt like I was swimming upstream because I would look out at a sea of faces and just not sure if they were with me, and not really clear how many were not with me, right? Performing calculations at the front of the room, but not being sure that it was really landing at the way that it should have landed for students. And then out of water, that it didn't feel like it was an experience that utilized my strengths in the classroom, to watch them have me perform a calculation, wonder whether or not they were with me, try to look for cues. It was all of it felt really unnatural to me. So one of the things I did early on is I tried to collect some data about the pace of content delivery or lecture. So one of the poll questions I asked students was, tell me about the pace of lecture. Does it feel too slow, a little slow? And here you'll see the responses, and about 40% said just right most of the time. So my sense of like shooting down the middle, I guess I was sort of accomplishing it, but that meant for 60% of students, it was not the right pace. And so my dissatisfaction with that notion of the content delivery pace bore out in that students really were processing the information at different rates. And I wasn't able to really accommodate those different rates very well in my class sessions. So like Kelly, I was going to professional development workshops. I was learning about learning, and a colleague of mine at a conference very much like this one presented a tool called Camtasia to do screencasting. And of course, now in 2020, 2021, we're all very familiar with lecture capture, but about 10 years ago, that was not as common of an idea. And I just loved the notion that I might work a problem and then pose that problem online that students could watch at the pace that felt comfortable. They could hit pause, they could rewatch. They could even bypass the entire video. If they saw the formula for standard deviation, for example, and they didn't even need to see me do it, they could really tackle it. Maybe they'd already had a stats course, for example, and they didn't need this explanation. So it really offered the opportunity to sort of individualize the instruction for students at the pace that felt right for them. So like Kelly, I collected some data around this transformation of having these videos posted. So there were about 80 to 100 short videos that students watch primarily before they come to class. So they would watch 3, 4 short videos, and then we start class with a quiz on that content. And then we proceed through some material. And in the early instantations of this redesign, it was really proceeding through homework assignments and helping them in class sessions with homework assignments. So many of you may recognize this as a flipped format. So I collected data, not only looking at a common final exam across this redesign, but also around their interest in the subject matter. Because as I mentioned at the start, thinking about their mindset around quantitative subjects, for many of my students, there was a lot of apprehension about taking a statistics course. And what I was also experiencing is when I would go out to my professional conferences as a quantitative psychologist, I would go out and I'd be the only person who looked like me in my professional conferences. I wondered, where were the women? Where were the people of color? And I looked in my classroom and I saw a very different group of people than I was seeing in my professional spaces. And that disconnect for me felt really hard to reconcile. So I wanted to think about, how do we invite people into our fields? Well, for one, it's having a positive, successful experience in an introductory course, right? So not only doing better, but also liking the subject matter enough to continue to take the next course, to think about maybe doing some research if that's of interest to a student. So I ask them questions on the scale of interest, like, I think I'll be able to use what I learn in this course in other courses, or I'm interested in the subject matter of this course, a variety of questions that really get at their interest in the topic. And I also saw these improve as a result of redesigning my course, which again, coupled with success in the course, that interest level could then potentially invite them to consider a subsequent course in statistics or a methods course. And this is what I wanted to do, was to potentially think about how we broaden participation in our disciplines and fields. So I'm offering this especially for instructors who are in that sort of first course. These are not gatekeeping courses, right? They're gateway courses. They're opportunities for us to create space for students who may not have thought of themselves in your fields. And so hopefully they will have not only a successful experience because you've designed it that way, but because they'll also enjoy what they're doing in that course. So I wanted to ask you if you've ever polled your students about the pace of lecture. Is that something that you have found yourself doing? And Kelly's posted a poll on the screen. Okay, so I'm seeing slightly more than half say no. And about a third say yes, right? This is a really simple technique and approach you could do even through polling to ask about the pace of lecture. Zoom, of course, has the feature of go faster, go slower, but it doesn't necessarily quantify it in the way that a poll might, or using Poll Everywhere or something like that. Or a simple thumbs up, thumbs down, like it's the right pace, it's not the right pace, right? So just having some way of gauging that. And the reason I like that is because it also conveys to your students that you are not going to just keep plowing ahead through the material, that you actually care whether or not it's landing at the pace that feels appropriate to them, and that you adjust accordingly, right? So you're not going to get 100% consensus when you ask the question, but at least you'll have a sense of how much you might need to adjust. And then there might be some class sessions where you might need to do this 2 or 3 times just because the material is so dense, and it would be helpful to gauge that. So it's a really useful technique to again convey to your students that it matters to you that pace is feeling right. So some of the objectives we had for you in the session were to think about inequities that arise in an unstructured learning environment. I really appreciate the rich discussion that was happening in the chat as well. Even after we moved on, I know that people were thinking about that question about resources and that sometimes what feels like the tension between creativity and openness to an assignment. So we want to play with that idea a little bit more through some scenarios that we're going to pose in just a moment, and then describing techniques that add structure and equity into a classroom. So of course we don't want to constrain creativity, but we do want to provide opportunities for people to feel that they've got enough information to know how to do a task, to know what is expected of them. To not assume that they understand how group work works, for example. So providing that structure. And so we'd like to practice some of these ideas by providing some scenarios and allowing you to brainstorm. So the tip here is to check off objectives as you go, so students are clear about what they should be able to do and at what point. So we've checked off a couple here, and we'll move into this third objectives now.
Okay, so we're going to move you back into breakout groups, and each group is going to have a scenario. There are 3 different scenarios, so you'll be assigned to one of the 3. When you get into your group, you're going to take about 1 minute of silence to read and think before you dive into that discussion. So we'll ask you to just moderate that informally. And then after you read the scenario together, you're going to brainstorm some tips for the professor to bring structure and equity to the class. So we'll have you in your groups for about 6 minutes, 1 minute to think and 5 minutes to talk. This can go kind of fast, so make sure everyone's rotating around and sharing some ideas. And for the reporter, this time we're going to ask the person whose birthplace is the farthest away from, we're going to choose Milwaukee. So the farthest away from Milwaukee will be the reporter for the group. And this reporter is going to give us their few best tips in about 60 seconds. So it may not be everything, but 60 seconds or less to give us a few of your ideas. And so you see in the chat, you have a link to Google Docs. So pay attention when you go into your breakout room, which breakout number you are. So if you were in breakout room 6, you see you would be assigned to scenario A. If you were in team breakout room 13, you'd be scenario B. So there's a Google Doc, and we'll ask you to put some ideas on the Google Doc, which is a nice way with technology for the instructors to be able to see where you're at in terms of doing your work as a group. So it's a way that we'll be looking as well. Did you want to add anything, VIJI?
Yeah, the only other thing I'd add is if you have someone in your group who is unable to pull up the Google Doc for any reason, if you could share your screen so that they could at least see the scenario and some of your notes, you're welcome to do that. And if you have questions at any point, either accessing the Google Doc or knowing what to do when, feel free to raise your hand. One of us will come in and get you started.
Okay, so you should see a room assignment, and if you don't, just give me a minute. We had a few people get shuffled around, and I will assign you very quickly.
All right, welcome back. I know some of you had some difficulty getting the Google Doc. My apologies. It seems like it's a versioning issue for Zoom, that sometimes it follows you, your chat follows you into the breakout room, and sometimes it doesn't. So I encourage you to maybe investigate that a little further if this is an approach that you are using. And we'll be sure to prompt people to click the link before they leave.
So if anybody didn't get a chance to do the activity, we're going to walk through it. So we apologize you didn't get the chance to do it together, but we are going to walk through it. So you'll get to see all 3 scenarios.
Absolutely. Yeah. So think through it. And we're going to, we have a lot of groups, so we won't hear from every group. We're going to just pick a couple to talk to about some of their strategies, and then share some more pre-brainstormed ideas. So if we have time at the end, we're happy to open it up to a broader discussion, but we want to make sure that we talk through each scenario and some of the ways they fit together as well. So the tip here is leading discussions easier when everyone knows the rules that we want to stick with. And so I'm going to be pulling up my clock here on my trusty device and putting in a minute, and we will get started with the first scenario. Liliana is excited to take a course on Latinx history. However, she hates talking in front of the class, and it's a pretty big class. She's done the readings and loves the discussion in class, but she's afraid the instructor thinks she isn't engaged enough because she never raises her hand to speak. Chris is enjoying this course. They love how the instructor gives scenarios and asks the students to pose ideas. They enjoy participating a lot and appreciate how interactive the class is. So if you were able to discuss the scenario, if you could write your name in the chat window, if this is one that came up in your group. Great. Okay. Let's hear from Teresa.
Hi. So I will say our group was similar to what other groups suggested. We had suggested having the class break into small group discussions so that maybe Liliana might feel more comfortable in the smaller group. We also suggested that students could write down their individual thoughts or responses, and those could be shared in a variety of ways within the class, like having them exchange and read other people's responses or handing them in after class. And then online polling, kind of like what we've been doing, having students type out their responses or thoughts online, and that those could show up to see the variety of responses.
Great. You did an excellent job. Teresa, I would like to know where you were born.
San Francisco.
San Francisco. Great. Okay, perfect. So I'll invite anybody else in who discussed this group, the scenario. If you want to type in the chat window, maybe one other idea that maybe your group had that Teresa hadn't mentioned, you're welcome to put that in there. And of course, everybody's got the link to the Google Doc, so you can always open up that first scenario and see the summary of the discussion as well. Great. So we're going to offer just a few suggestions as well. Good. Yep. Recording responses, reading ahead of time, an exit ticket. Love the idea of an exit ticket too. So the perfect examples, like using small group rather than large class discussion, right? Giving them a chance to vet ideas in a smaller setting. Technology, maybe not paper for a while, but technology at least, to collect answers. Thinking about some of the approaches you've offered here, like the exit ticket or the circle group, so different kinds of approaches for that, as well as allowing for think time and a think, pair, share, right? So we often rush to turn to your neighbor and start talking, and that's exactly what they do, turn to a neighbor and start talking. And that doesn't mean that what ends up happening is that some students don't have the opportunity to think about their own individual response. So moderate the thinking time before the think, pair, share, and then say, now you can turn to your neighbor and begin the discussion. Using working agreements about the rules, like you won't be randomly called on unless you've discussed with your group and you're simply reporting for your group, right? So that can take the sting out of being wrong, for example, which is one of the reasons why we might not hear from every student. And we'd be remiss if we said these were not, generally, these are good tips for your faculty meetings as well, thinking about who is not speaking or participating and why.
All right, scenario B, a class with 25 students has one underrepresented female. The instructor poses a question to the class. This student is feeling very anxious that if she doesn't answer correctly, everyone will find out she doesn't belong at this institution. She doesn't raise her hand despite wanting to be a part of the conversation. So let's try another approach for just getting a couple ideas out there. So I used my random number generator, and group number 22 has come up. So if you were group 22, would you be willing to share a few ideas? Who's the rep there? Going once, going twice.
I don't know if I'm the rep there or if Tracy wants to be the rep there. We didn't actually get to talking about who is the rep there. Let's see. So we talked about anonymous options for participation, and we talked about sense of belonging things. So stereotype threat, imposter syndrome, talking about that stuff explicitly. But what we didn't get to was just how you build a sense of belonging in a classroom broadly, and what that can look like. So that would be another thing I might add.
Great. And Devin, where were you born?
Evanston, Illinois.
Uh-huh. So this question of like sorting people as reporters based on something like where were you born, all kinds of questions can be a really nice way to also build community, because people learn things about each other that they might not know, right? So it builds community. So once again, if anybody wants to represent some of the things that have come out and wants to put them in the chat, by all means, but Devin definitely gave us some ideas about where we should be thinking, right? That this student feels like they don't belong at this institution. And that's not true. That's just her perception, right? So we want to be thinking about some of the things that Devin said about stereotype threat and imposter syndrome, and think about how do we counteract that, right? So I would agree that this student may be facing imposter syndrome, but it could also be quite exclusionary, real systemic messages that say you don't belong here, right? And so we want to be explicit about promoting access and equity for all of our students. And one way to do this is to simply say, you all belong here. And I find this can be really meaningful after exam 1 in their first science class. Many of them are like crushed and thinking, forget it, I can't be a science major, I can't be a doctor. And all of this after one exam in their first class in college, right? And so it can be really meaningful. And the idea of structure often is that it doesn't harm the people that don't need it, right? And so this can be a really meaningful phrase for some students, and for others who never question their belonging, it's certainly not going to harm them to hear it, but it can be really meaningful. So we want to also make sure we have diverse role models that are represented in the course, from the reading lists, and all kinds of diverse people enter into the classroom and the curriculum in a variety of ways. We want to build confidence in students by using varied active learning activities. And so I would guess many of you came up with a variety of ideas that look similar to the first scenario: small groups, think, pair, share, anonymous ways to report. So we heard that, right? Those things will all build confidence. And sometimes it takes a few class sessions, and sometimes it takes a year, but for her to see that she's doing what her peers are doing. Creating an environment where mistakes are normalized, right? A lot of our students think we're instructors because we were just born this way and can just do this stuff and we're brilliant. But in fact, we all know we made mistakes getting to where we are, and acknowledging that is how learning works is really important. So you may even want to share your own personal story of growth in that way. And random calling. I think it is important that we reduce bias in the classroom. There's some interesting research about students creating their own stereotypes about who belongs in a classroom based on who answers questions. And so randomizing this can be really important in reducing bias, but you want to do it in a safe way where students feel like they've had a chance to discuss with their class first and think about that safety aspect.
All right, so the third and final scenario, and I hope you realize that at least for the first 2 scenarios, some of the solutions or structures that you put in place are similar, even though the scenarios are a little bit different from one another. And those really have to do with that sort of facilitation aspect of inclusive teaching. This third scenario is slightly different in flavor. An introductory biology course is taught by an instructor that gives 3 exams and a final. The syllabus lists topics, and the instructor sticks to these topics each day with a clear lecture via PowerPoint slides. The instructor is an engaging lecturer that many students like. There's a textbook and a campus help center that the instructor sends struggling students to. Taylor is a struggling student. He's from a rural town in the state, and neither of his parents attended college. He failed his first exam, and it seems that everyone else knew what to study and how to study. High school was a breeze, but he doesn't even know where to begin to approach this class. So this is a very common scenario in my course, and it may be in some of yours as well, right? So I'm going to do a call in a slightly different way than the ones we've modeled so far. I peeked into the Google Doc, and I liked the response. There were many responses I liked, and I wanted to ask if Team 35 could share some of the approaches that they offered in the Google Doc.
Sure.
Great.
So, yes, I was born in Connecticut, so that was the farthest away.
Right.
This is Natalia. So our ideas were to maybe add assignments so that the grades aren't only coming from the exams, adding some group work, like we talked about earlier, adding low stakes quizzes for practice, low stakes formative assessments, multiple attempts on some low stakes assessments, and study guides and practice tests. So those are all things, where students get the opportunity to have some repetition and some practice.
Excellent. Great. Thank you.
No problem.
And I want to point out that I've had my timer going for each response. Everybody stuck very, very well to a minute and under. So we know that this is possible. And we certainly have been in meetings where we've said briefly explain or briefly introduce. And everybody's definition of brief is really different. So sometimes providing even just the numerical 60 seconds is helpful for people to know what you mean by that. So this scenario really does harken to that notion of practice and really thinking about how do you collect assessment evidence potentially from every student at every session to help the student practice high stakes assessments and to improve their own metacognition. So we want to be sure that people not only know what they should know, but that they feel comfortable, that they could gauge that I might do okay on an upcoming exam based on how I've been doing so far. And not be surprised, right? Like that's what you want to avoid is the surprise element at an exam. And so Kelly and I like to use what are called TTQs or typical test questions. And we will label our questions that we pose to students as TTQs so that they know, oh, this is the caliber of question I'll be expected to answer in an upcoming assessment. So that can help build their metacognition as well, because we know not all questions are built the same. And if they try to practice, for example, the end of chapter questions, they may not be the caliber of questions you want them to be able to do. So we find that being explicit, as you've offered in the chat, it's important to share with students why you're doing what you're doing. Don't hide this good work of the inclusive teaching. Tell them why you're using random call, for example. Tell them why you're using TTQs so that they understand your approaches as well. Course structure with required, not optional, practice before, during, and after class. This is one that I learned the hard way. I made a study guide for my students. I was so proud of how well the study guide would prepare my students for an upcoming exam, only to learn on the day of the exam that not everybody even opened the attachment or opened the document on my learning management system, right? So just because you post it doesn't mean they'll come. And if you find that there's something that's really helpful to your students, then think about how you might engage all your learners in that activity. So now that wonderful study guide is assignment 4 before the exam. So every student should engage with that study guide because optional is, that's again, a chance or a privilege, right? To be able to do extra work to prepare for a class or to know that I should do all of the practice guides, right? So how do we incorporate that structure? And a syllabus that has clear dates and deadlines with specific readings and goals, so you're really clear about where they should be and by when. Objectives presented for each lesson with less telling and more asking, so students can learn what they know and don't know, and that tests align with these objectives. Again, you don't want that surprise element. You really want students to say, oh, that was fair because it was very similar to the kinds of work I had to do up to this point, and that by posing the questions, they're really practicing and recalling the information and being able to apply the information instead of feeling comfortable sort of highlighting or re-highlighting text, for example. Consider a grading schema where each exam carries less weight and there's more lower stakes quizzes and assignments, or even an exam grade can be dropped. I love the notion that Natalia's group talked about, like retaking things, that you're really building in that opportunity to say, yeah, learning does include some missteps and that's okay. And I'm building a course that accounts for those missteps by giving you multiple opportunities. And this is important because we often say, especially in STEM courses, we say failure is a part of STEM, right? Like you have to make mistakes and you have to learn from those mistakes. And I think in general, we say that about learning, but then we look at the way our grades are structured and there's no room for a misstep. If you don't turn something in, it's a 0. If you do poorly on a single exam, then it has a detrimental effect on the overall average. So how do we build in some grace around those grading criteria as well? And explicitly acknowledging that differences exist with students and that with a growth mindset, all students can achieve. So in this case, just a little bit of hope that not only the grading schema is there to support their continued learning in the course, but that this is a normal aspect of learning and that it is something that could be improved with practice, right? And the growth mindset is very important. So now we've brainstormed some ways to reduce inequities in courses, thinking about both the facilitation piece as well as the design piece, the course design piece.
So we want to give you a bit of time to finish this workshop with some time for reflection. So we're going to ask you to do that again with Poll Everywhere, and VIJI will put the link into the chat. And the question is, now that we've spent time thinking about inclusive teaching, provide something specific you will do as a result of the discussion. And it might be something we've said, it might be something shared in the chat with your colleagues, or something that you talked about in your breakout. And it might be something small that you do tomorrow versus something that you know you'll be planning for semesters to come. So feel free to share anything, and we'll all take a look while we take some time to reflect. There are so many great ideas here. Some of you have some work ahead of you trying to get demographic data, and others, it's just some blue boxes. And we use blue, we should say, because that's the color at our university. We call that Carolina blue or Tar Heel blue, but you can certainly change the color to fit your needs. Yeah, really great stuff coming in here. I wanted to also just acknowledge there was a lot going on in the chat that we couldn't get to, and it really, once again, highlights this tension of like, oh, it's a good idea to ask questions that randomize students, but that question needs to be asked. That's a sensitive question, or should I ask a question like that, right? And there are no right answers. There are probably some things that you shouldn't do, but it is really good to just keep asking colleagues about things you want to try, but don't let that inhibit you building community in your classroom. So I really appreciate your back and forth within the chat as well. So as we near the end of our time together, we wanted to give you a chance. If you had any other questions, please feel anything you want to talk about, feel free to put something in the chat. We wanted to also, as we end, put up a link to some of the tips that we've been sharing here, and VIJI will put that into the chat. We're also both on Twitter, and we love having conversations on Twitter and sharing ideas about teaching, especially inclusive teaching. So we hope you'll join us there if you're also on Twitter. And we'll take a moment just to see if any questions come in through the chat.
Yeah,
Yes.
I really enjoyed your discussion here. Thank you for continuing. Keep having these conversations. This is part of it. It's not a destination. It is the journey. And so really thinking through how you evolve your practice as our students evolve, as our own craft of teaching evolves.
Oh, I see a question here from Devin. Should groups be assigned, or should students choose their groups, is the basic question. And once again, there's not a right answer here, but it should be intentional, whatever you do. You can think about classes where you want to balance certain demographics or experience, but do remember that when you just ask students to, like in a classroom, turn to a neighbor, that often people will be left out. So making sure everybody has a group member is probably the most basic component of that. And then thinking through whether you want to assign students or have some self-selection. I usually lean towards assigning group members. And it can be random or it can be based on certain things, but I think there are a lot of good reasons to assign. But once again, recognizing that those students might not know each other and you need to spend time allowing them to get to know each other, building those activities, how to do group work, right? So we don't just throw people together, although we just did to you, throw people together and expect them to work well together. Don't take that as the best modeling practice, right? We did that quickly for a workshop, but within our classrooms, we have more time to build that.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for modeling techniques that we can use in every single one of our courses, whether that course is online or face-to-face or a blended course. Your data really speak loudly. Structuring active learning has an impact on student engagement, their interests in the course, their learning, and their success. A reduction of 40% in final grades of D and F is pretty astounding. Mm-hmm. And when I think about this, what is the mechanism or the mediator? A number of things come to mind. That structuring of active learning is distributing the practice that students have. It's enhancing that. It seems to also the structured active learning techniques that you modeled be enhancing students' sense of community, their interaction, their engagement with one another. And I think at a fundamental level that the effects of both increasing distributed practice and increasing a sense of community could also be increasing students' sense of control over what they can do in their learning. And that is so powerful. Mm-hmm. Also wanted to say that I really appreciated the fact that you've encouraged us all to look at our data. And you're also facilitating that examination of the data on your own campus with that dashboard. Mm-hmm. So just very inspiring, I think, for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. That was a great summary. Exactly what we hoped you would take away.
Well, great. Well, thank you. And any further, I don't think we have any. People are all saying thank you. I'm looking at the chat right now and just say we have great gratitude for this. Thank you.
Thank you.